Thank you so much, and thanks, Justin. So while we're getting the PowerPoint up, I want you to turn to your neighbor and tell them just really quickly, you've got a shoulder partner, someone sitting next to you, and if you aren't happy with the person sitting next to you, get up and go to the restroom. When you come back in, sit somewhere else, and they'll never know. It's really subtle. Just kidding. So turn to your shoulder partner, tell them about your first grade teacher. You've got 2 minutes. So each person take 1 minute, tell them about your first grade teacher. Okay, try to wrap up your stories about your first grade teacher and the memory that you have of how he or she might have changed the trajectory of the rest of your student career. I think what's interesting is, as I sat down to think about what I would say to all of you, I realized I only ever really have a captive audience of kids a couple of times, and that's my own children, and they don't generally listen. And then today, a day like today where I get a chance to talk to students. And when I sat down to think about what I would say, I really struggled with how to get the message across, because I knew what I wanted you to come away with, but as I tried to put words to paper and tried to put the PowerPoint together, I struggled, which surprised me because over the last 20 years, I've probably had thousands and thousands of presentations, and never have I struggled as much as trying to get across the message that I want you to leave with today. And I think that's because what I really want you to leave with today, there really aren't enough words to express. And that's how amazing each and every one of you are as an individual and collectively as students who are here today. So as I tried to think about how to get that message across, I've got a series of stories that I want to tell you. How many of you remember kindergarten? What was the best part of kindergarten besides naps? Story time, right? Yeah, besides naps. It definitely wasn't lunch, right? School lunch program, that's a whole other issue. So we're going to talk today about some stories, okay? Because what I think is really important is, even though I didn't know what any of the speakers who stood up before me were going to talk about, every one of them told a story. And every one of them involved a teacher. So I want you to understand that before you leave today, the message is not just how important you are, but how important it is that you tell your story to everyone around you, and especially your teachers. And we're going to talk about why that matters, and we're going to go through a series of stories today that I hope you leave with that inspire you to be that story for someone. So to get us started, I wanted to just start with what's called the wise teacher story. And you may have heard this, but if you have, stories get better every time you hear them, right? Some stories get better every time you hear them. So the wise teacher and the jar. This is a story about a wise teacher and a jar. There was once a very wise teacher whose words of wisdom students would come from far and wide to hear. One day, as usual, many students began to gather in the teaching room. They came in and sat down very quietly, looking to the front with keen anticipation, ready to hear what the teacher had to say. Eventually, the teacher came in and sat down in front of the students. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. On one side of the teacher was a large glass jar. On the other side was a pile of dark gray rocks. Without saying a word, the teacher began to pick up the rocks one by one and place them very carefully in the glass jar. Plonk, plonk. When all the rocks were in the jar, the teacher turned to the students and asked, "Is the jar full?" "Yes," the students said. "Yes, teacher, the jar's full." Without saying a word, the teacher began to drop small, round, pink pebbles carefully into the large glass jar so they fell down between the big rocks. Clickety-click, clickety-click. When all the pebbles were in the jar, the teacher turned to the students and asked, "Is the jar now full?" The students looked at one another, and then some of them started nodding and saying, "Yes, yes, teacher, the jar's now full. Yes, we think so." Without saying a word, the teacher took some fine silver sand and let it trickle with a gentle sighing sound into the large glass jar, whoosh, where it settled around the pink pebbles and the dark gray rocks. When the sand was in the jar, the teacher turned to the students and she asked, "What? Is the jar now full?" The students were not so confident this time, but the sand had clearly filled the space, and the jar looked so full that a few students still nodded and said, "Yes, teacher, the jar's now full. Now it's full." Without saying a word, the teacher took a jug of water and poured it carefully without splashing a drop into the large glass jar. Look, look, look. When the water reached the brim, the teacher turned to the students and asked, "What? Is the jar now full?" Most of the students were silent at this time, but 2 or 3 ventured an answer. "Yes, teacher, the jar is now full. Now it has to be." Without saying a word, the teacher took a handful of salt and sprinkled it slowly over the top of the water with a very quiet whooshing sound. Whoosh, whoosh. When all the salt had dissolved into the water, the teacher turned to the students and asked one more time. Last time? "Is the jar now full?" The students were totally silent. Eventually, one brave student said, "Yes, teacher, the jar is now full. The jar is now full." The teacher then said, "A story always has many meanings, and you each have understood many things from this demonstration. Now discuss quietly amongst yourselves what meanings the story has for you. How many different messages can you find in the story to take away? The students looked at the wise teacher and at the beautiful glass jar filled with gray rocks, pink pebbles, silver sand, water, and salt. Then they quietly discussed with one another the meanings the story had for them. After a few minutes, the wise teacher raised one hand and the room fell silent. The teacher said, "Remember, there's never just one interpretation of anything. You've all taken away so many meanings and so many messages from the story, and each meaning is as important as the other, and it's as valid as any other." And without saying another word, the teacher got up and left the room. And so what I want to talk to you now is a tale of two perspectives. So in this story, you realize there's multiple ways to look at that. You might have taken away a message about what it means to be full. You might have taken away the message about how those spaces fill up. But what I want you to really think about is it's about perspective. And I want to talk to you about a student perspective and a teacher perspective because it means a lot to me for you to understand how much you mean to all of us in education. And when I think about the student's perspective, each and every one of you could remember a first grade teacher. Sometimes that was a teacher who made a difference, sometimes it was a different teacher. Sometimes you have multiple teachers. Governor Branstad remembered his 8th grade teacher, who he says is the reason he went into public office and wanted to run for governor. So when I talk to students, they always have a story about a teacher. Sometimes they remember how a teacher made them feel in a positive way. But I have a lot of stories and I have a lot of conversations with students where teachers make them feel differently. They make them feel, without even realizing it, like they're less, like they can't do something, like they can't achieve. And so teachers can make a difference both ways, not just positively, but negatively as well. So I know we asked you to remember your best first grade teacher memory, but I also bet if I asked you to remember something that a teacher said to you that you still remember today that was really hurtful, you probably all could remember that too. And it's because teachers are human beings, and like everyone else, they do the best they can with what they know, and sometimes they don't know that what they're saying might send a message to you that they never meant to say. Sometimes they don't understand that when they're sending those messages and talking to you about certain things, maybe they don't know your background. Maybe they don't understand where you come from. Maybe they don't understand the language you speak or the culture that you bring to the classroom. And in times they say things that sometimes feel like they don't understand you and or that are hurtful to you. So we're gonna talk today about a group of teachers. Because when I talk to teachers about what makes a difference for them, I'm gonna share a story with you now. I had the opportunity to work with a group of elementary teachers here in Des Moines. And those teachers were working on getting their ESL endorsement. And most of those teachers didn't look anything like the students they taught. And they grew up in very different experiences. Their story was not the same story as the students that they were working with. And so they were trying to learn strategies. They were trying to learn ways to do a better job of teaching the content, getting across the message, making sure it's comprehensible. And as we started going through the strategies, that I realized that something that was really missing was their connection to the kids. They didn't know their students. They didn't know the students' background. They didn't know that students had a story to tell. So I scheduled a home visit for them. Each and every one of those teachers went and spent half a day in a home with a parent from a student in their classroom. And when they came back the next time we were together, I planned on spending about the first 45 minutes just thinking through that experience with the teachers. And I just started asking them, so what did that experience mean to you? What did you learn? What are the key takeaways? What are your aha moments? And it was silent. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, and we spent the next 3 hours debriefing the home visit. Those teachers said to me, I didn't know that my students came from poverty. I didn't realize that my students came to school that were food insecure and they don't have breakfast in the morning. I didn't realize that so many of my students have families that care so much about them, but the parents are working 2 and 3 jobs and they're not there at nighttime when the kids go home. I didn't know that. And now that I know that, I guarantee you, I'm gonna change the way I work with the kids. And that's exactly what happened. It wasn't a single strategy that I delivered to the students that made a difference. It was the connection to the kids and the stories and the homes and the families that really made a difference in those teachers' lives. So what does that mean to all of us? And what does it mean to education? My story. It means that every one of us has to be willing to tell our story. We have to be willing to step up and be courageous and tell the parts of us that maybe are not the things people see. Because that's the way people connect with you. That's the way people connect with what you need. And so my story, what do you see when you look at me? Do you see my bio? What do you see? Do you see education? I guarantee you probably do see poverty. Do you see poverty? I'm going to tell one part of my story. So when I grew up in poverty, and that may not be what you see. But when I was growing up, my dad was a farmer. And when I was in middle school, I don't know if any of you can think back to history of Iowa, but we went through something called the farm crisis. And I was a product of the farm crisis. We went from living in one of the nicest houses in Columbus Junction, Iowa, southeast Iowa, born and raised, product of Iowa Public Schools, to having to sell the house and actually losing the house and then moving into an apartment. And so overnight, I was thrown into poverty. And I will never forget the day that we used to have what, I know this is gonna scare you, but we used to have what were called lunch tickets. They were pieces of paper. And we used to take them in for lunchtime and they would punch them. So we had 10 punches on our lunch card, we bought 10 punches. Well, at the time that I had my lunch card, I watched it. And have you ever watched anything in your jean pocket back in the days before your cell phones and you actually had paper things to carry around with you? I watched it. And in school, if you watched your lunch ticket, you took it back into the office, you told them on your honor how many punches you had and they gave you a new card. And it really was that simple. So I went in and I handed it to the secretary and all my girlfriends were with me because it was about lunchtime and we were getting ready to go in, and I said, I watched my lunch ticket and I need a new lunch ticket. And she gets ready to give it to me and she looks up, she goes, oh, I can't replace your lunch ticket. It's like, why can't you replace my lunch ticket? I had like 4 punches at least left. And she said, because you're on free lunch. And honestly, I didn't even know I was on free lunch. I didn't know my parents had signed me up for free lunch. I didn't know that that was something that was an issue with getting another lunch ticket. So that was the last day I ever ate school lunch, because there was no way I was ever going to subject myself to that level of humility again. And that was a secretary, it wasn't a teacher, but it's the same thing. Had she known, maybe, that I was from poverty, had she known how that would make me feel, had she known that I would never eat another school lunch as long as I lived, she might have chosen a different response to me. Had she known that all my friends were standing with me and that I would then have to explain to them, what do you mean you're on free lunch? What does that mean? And that would forever change not only the way I felt about her, but the way I felt about myself for a very long time. So I tell you that story, why? Because I want you to tell your story. Because it is so important for you to leave today and have the courage to tell your story, the good parts, the bad parts, the ugly parts, so that your teachers, your administrators, the community members, so that they understand how important it is that they not only treat each and every one of you with respect, but each and every one of your peers as well, and that they get to know every student on an individual basis, so that every time they get ready to make a statement like they might have made, for example, when I needed my lunch ticket replaced, they'll think about what might that feel like to a student if I frame it this way. What might I need to know about a student's culture if I want to be able to connect with that student? So I want you to start thinking about how to tell your story. What is your story? And how might you tell other people? And how might you telling your story encourage your friend to tell their story? Because maybe their story is not the same as your story and everyone needs to understand it. But what I do know for sure is that each of you can get out of your comfort zone, hop into a new spot, and tell your story and make a tremendous splash for someone else. And so I do encourage you today when you leave to think about how to tell your story. And my very favorite story of all times, how many of you have ever heard of We're the Ones We've Been Waiting For by the Hopi Elders? Good, because it's an amazing story and the first time you hear it, it will resonate with you. So the Hopi Elders tell a story about how to make a difference and what you need to do if you're thinking about your responsibility to tell your story and think about how you might impact others. The Hopi Elders talk about a story called We're the Ones We've Been Waiting For. The Hopi elder came to his group and he said to the tribe, he said, "You've all been telling people that this is the 11th hour. Now you must go back and tell the people that this is the hour. There are things to be considered. For example, where are you living? What are you doing? What are your relationships? Are you in the right relation? Where's your water? Know your garden. And lastly, it's time to speak your truth. Create your community, be good to each other, and do not look outside yourself for the leader. This could be a good time. But there's a river that's flowing very fast, and it's so great and swift that there are those who are going to be afraid. They'll try to hold on to the shore, and they'll feel that they're being torn apart, and they will suffer greatly. But know that the river has a destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off in the middle of the river, keep our eyes open and our heads above water. See who's in there with you and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment that we do, our spiritual growth and journey comes to a halt. Right now, banish the word struggle from your vocabulary. All that we do must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration, because we are the ones that we've been waiting for. And I want to just remind you and your teachers and administrators that in the 2013 conference, Governor Terry Branstad wore this t-shirt. I wish he was still here. He may not remember, but I'm sure he carries it around. I carry this with me everywhere. The t-shirt says, it was the theme of the Our Kids 2013 Summer Institute, and it says, kids don't care how much you know, and on the back it says, until they know how much you care. So give yourselves a big round of applause, tell your story.